welcome everyone to the Art Business Podcast, where we explore the art market, collecting and the business behind the scenes. My name's David Bellingham. I'm Programme Director of the MA Art Business in London. And today I'm joined by Charlotte Stewart, Managing Director at MyArtBroker, or one word, a leading platform connecting collectors and sellers in the modern and contemporary prints market. Charlotte, thank you very much for joining us today in a very busy week, Frieze Week.
Thank you very much for having me, David.
So could you start by telling us about your journey into the art market? You know, what drew you to this world?
Yes, is a little less traditional perhaps than some. I never thought I wanted to work in the art world. My mother was an artist, which is an artist, which is enough to put anyone off. I always think you try not to follow in parents' footsteps. But I was always drawn by imagery. So imagery was, from a very young age, I remember being obsessed with, whether it was branding or iconography but there was always around stories. It was about brands and stories. One of my first obsessions when I was younger were cowboy Western movies and big shots from like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, or Marilyn in her white dress. I mean, I had those pictures up on my wall when I was way too young to be appreciating that level of culture or that genre. And I actually went to Goldsmiths University seeking to do an English literature degree because they did something very specific. I mean, I did art at A level and I did history of art at A level, and I always did English though. And I wanted to write about art. I wanted to write stories, like stories about why and how someone does something were everything to me. And so I followed a journalistic path, but I knew I wanted it to be about image and about art. So I did it at Goldsmiths, which is an amazing course where you were able to combine art and literature. So, for instance, we used to do a huge amount of study on film and imagery and poetry and combining those disciplines together and understanding how they make people feel and these huge sort of cinematic moments that connected the art world and the literature world and politics. I learned most of my history through that. And then I did a postgrad in journalism. And then I ended up seeking a job where I could write about art. So I tried in every way I could back then. It was ID magazine was the absolute sort of jewel on the crown for me. Dazed and Confused magazine. So I did a few internships, worked briefly at Condé Nast as a editorial assistant, which is fashion, which I really didn't enjoy because I was like, I don't understand this. I thought it was about creativity and art, and it wasn't. It was about trend following. And then I got a job with Christie's Top Client magazine, which at the time they had a very small run, and it was really only for very specialist collections, with Meredith Edington Smith, who sadly is no longer with us, but she was my first manager in the art world, and she was like deeply inspirational. And so I worked there, and then I started realizing all the different things you could do in the art world, because you don't know especially back then, there wasn't enough education about what you could do in the art world. The reason I didn't want to go into the art world is I thought that it was just for artists. And so I explored that more, started understanding a little bit about marketing, understanding what marketing was, because no one had really explained it to me before. And then from there went into content production for Christie's, and then on into a slightly weird segue into business management, which I was a business director for Decorative Arts when I left Christie's. And then from there, then we moved on through. But that was how it started. It was rather accidental more than anything.
Yeah, I apropos what you've just said about, didn't realize there was this other world out there with careers and so on. I think it's true still of the art world, that they don't, a lot of these jobs aren't advertised. People don't realize they exist. And I remember when my son was at school, I was asked to go to the careers evening for the school kids. And it was his boys' school and the girls' school next door came to it. And I had this sort of label saying jobs in the art business. And, the students are doing art history, and they would come up to me and they say, what is the art business? And then I'd say, well, sit down and I can tell you about all the jobs that my students go into. And all they were aware of is their kids going down the academic route, which most of them didn't seem to want to do, or, going in, joining the queues to get a job in Tate Gallery or something, maybe the auction houses, but none of the other things. So, I think there's still a little bit of education to be done there.
I think there is. And I think even now when I meet people sort of maybe in their early 20s looking for a role, they tend to think that there's sales, there's specialism, and therefore if you're a specialist, you must want to work in like a not for profit or a museum. And there's no specialism in the market. And they tend to be very like, you can't be both. There's nothing, and there's a huge amount of different roles you can do in this marketplace. And I feel exactly like you. I feel quite like the art industry, particularly probably the secondary market, does itself a disservice of really explaining to the next generation what the opportunities are. But then perhaps you need to discover them as you go at the same time, because it's difficult to, certainly it's very difficult for me to encapsulate what I do on a daily basis. It's like a million different things, which is why I
But
love
that makes it very exciting at the same time, and a voyage of discovery, as you say, for people
it.
going into that. So you've worked across traditional and, if I can put it that way, traditional analog and digital spaces. What was the turning point that led you to embrace technology in art brokerage?
So when I left Christie's mainly because I had a wonderful time at Christie's. I was there for over 10 years, and it was a very traditional and is a very traditional place. But I tell you, when I started at Christie's, felt like we were on a new frontier. I mean, we were cutting catalogue budgets and putting everything online. We were trying to launch online sales in at an upper level. I mean, the sort of the discussions that we used to have at Christie's, and we're only talking like 15 years ago, you would find extraordinary now. The specialists up in arms because half their sale was going to be sold online, within a 2-week window instead of live. And so there was a lot that at the time, it felt quite pioneering. I think the big catalyst for me was obviously I'd only worked in one big institution. That had really been my entire career. So you do become a bit of a one-trick pony in that respect. You know how it operates there, and you see some incredible things, and you work with some of the most incredible people. But it does become a little bit like sort of 5-year repetition of newness, and then the old maybe pushing against the newness, us being able to get a few things through. And that can slow innovation after a while. I think I then went off to be a consultant, and that was the real turning point, because my clients were regional auction houses, traditional regional auction houses, both in London and across the UK, and also VC companies who were investing in startups, like new apps, new whatever. So they would bring me in to consult on new products, new apps, new ideas. I mean, they were like, it was the Polaroid opposite. I'd have a sort of Monday morning with a traditional auction house talking about how we might be able to, upgrade their email marketing, which was still run on an incredibly archaic system. But you know what? They knew what they were doing. They brilliant specialists, very, very specialist to their particular subjects. And then in the afternoon, you'd have conversations with investment minded VC companies who were like, is this a good idea? Is it going to fly? What does it look like? How much money will it cost to build this technology? And then a lot of very keen, passionate entrepreneurs who were trying to build something. That went on for about 2 or 3 years. And it was a really polarizing period for me, because I was still quite an auction girl. I was very much like, I understood the auction world. I didn't understand the tech world really at all. But I understood the basic principles, and I understood, digital marketing was one of the main things I did at Christie's. If we can call it digital marketing, it wouldn't be seen as digital marketing these days. And then I met Ian and Josiah, who were a client at the time that I'd been working on a content strategy for. And MyArtBroker suddenly looked like the perfect combination of what I was looking for, which was new frontiers, pushing boundaries, building technology, making the collector number one. But they wanted to build something that was really specialist. They wanted to bring in, the scale, and where we are now is a very different business to how it was back in 2018. And I bang on about this a lot, but I wasn't looking for like a new startup tech platform run by a heavily backed investment fund that was going to disrupt and dismantle the strong, traditional, trusted juggernaut that is the art market. I was looking for something that felt right. And that's where MyArtBroker came in. And so I started, first of all, as their marketing director in 2018, and then became managing director in 2021 during the bank's years, which we were well positioned in at the time to do.
And that's, I'm just thinking date wise, that's also during COVID, the pandemic. And
Yeah.
it might surprise a lot of the listeners, particularly my younger students who think that the digital and all the online stuff only came about because of the pandemic. But as you've just said, it was going on very way back in the early 2000s. I remember Sotheby's beginning to think about online sales, and then it was happening at Christie's. It was in the air. So it's taken a long time. And I still think the pandemic did act as a catalyst to really speed up that process, you know.
Definitely. I mean, the pandemic basically was the wake up call that everybody needed. And, you know, as you know, we had a very fortunate pandemic at MyArtBroker because we were just by chance really well placed. Okay. Like you couldn't have crystal balled that one. You know, we were an online only, predominantly back then Banksy print brokerage. So we were in the right place at the right time. Banksy is really easy to trade online because, of course, as long as you have a pest control certificate, you don't need to see things. We also, you know, one of the brothers is probably the leading Banksy print specialists in the world. We were very lucky to be in exactly the right place, and the business just went absolutely bananas, which was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. But it feels like that was a very long time ago in terms of the market. And you know, we still do an awful lot of Banksy prints and Banksy originals, but it's a very different business these days to how it was back then.
So sort of slightly related, kind of related to what you've just said. What skills or experiences from your earlier career, maybe in the more traditional auction house roles, have been most valuable in your current role with MyArtBroker?
Oh, I was very fortunate at Christie's to work. I was probably the only person that was allowed to work within the specialist department and the marketing department. Normally at auction houses, they don't let those two groups of people meet. You know, they are almost divided by a big river and everyone thinks they don't really understand how it works, which is a shame because actually it's one of the fundamental problems with the kind of, I think the bigger art houses is that there is this like service department versus the specialist mentality, which is really unhelpful. I think that marketing, like, you know, by in my blood, I'm a marketeer, and MyArtBroker was a very different business back then. We needed to build it from a content authority perspective, but also it's an online traffic business, you know, like that's how it was. That's how it's grown really, is by knowing exactly what we want to be in the market. And search was absolutely everything to us in the early days. Now, how are we going to get somebody to go online looking for a valuation for a Warhol Marilyn and make sure that we're at the top spot? Like that we were obsessed with that for a long time, which is how we built out so much of our collector database, just giving them information where they want it. So content, editorial, journalism, storytelling, that I learned, it's always been in me. It's my passion, probably well and above art. That I, you know, had nurtured a lot through Christie's. And then I think what being a business manager in any business, so you're the business managers at Christie's or the business directors at Christie's, they, you know, there are sort of mini MDs, I suppose, for each department. You know, they really look at like strategy, they manage the P&L, they understand the fundamentals of making their department profitable, which actually I found really difficult working with VCs because that's not like, you know, they don't mind, they want to understand, you know, whereas I am very much sometimes to my colleagues' annoyance focused on profit. I have to be because it's a tech business without investment. So, you know, everything we make, we invest back into the business. So I think, you know, business management, the fundamentals of business management, and there are some incredible mentors at Christie's. In fact, one of them is now a coach. She's called Lucy Brown, and she was one of my managers at Christie's South Ken. And the things she taught me in the first 3 days, I think she thought, God, who have I got here? I've got some kind of content manager from, you know, creative, from marketing, and now I've got to teach her business, you know? But those formative years of running a P&L, running a business were really, really important. And all those skills are hugely transferable. And then I think the last thing would be allow specialists to be specialists and not business people. that is something that, or salespeople, don't expect specialists to be salespeople. Don't expect them to be business minded. Allow them to have their specialism. You do occasionally find a few that are unicorns. I call them unicorns because they're so rare. They're the ones that have huge amount of specialism, really understand the business needs and wants and aims and objectives, and are pretty good at sales as well. Understand like that it's a hustle business. And, you've got to be relatively thick skinned. And that's a rare combination in a person, I think.
Yeah, I was with my students at Sotheby's for the contemporary art preview. Obviously, coincided with Frieze Contemporary this week, and we had the specialist taking us around, and I could see those skills more in one maybe than in the other, but they both had that. They were able. So basically, they rely on their art historical background to sell the work to you by telling you about Francis Bacon, what a wonderful artist. Look at his brushwork, etc., etc. And then every now and then they would add, and you're art business students. So actually, and they would say some really, really valuable things for my students about where that market sits at the moment. Business strategies. Lot number one is an unknown woman artist who's, this is only good. This is 30 to 50,000 pounds. Which is still quite a lot of money, but the artist is. So we're introducing them as lot one. That isn't new. That's been done in the past on the secondary market. But you do. These people will. You said let specialists be specialists, and they will sell the work simply by being specialists.
Yeah,
It's quite seductive listening to the art history still.
it is. But I also think it depends on, when I think about real salespeople, they change their story based on who they're talking to,
Who they
right?
exactly?
In the same way, that's what you do with marketing as well. It's great if you've got somebody, in the Prince world, there's a lot of different people with very different objectives, and they sometimes need a different approach. So yeah, pitch, yeah.
So for listeners who don't know, we've been talking about this for several minutes now. What exactly does MyArtBroker do, and how does it differ from a gallery or auction house?
What does my art broker do? Really, really good question, because it's one of those where I think if you know my art broker, you know exactly what we do. But a lot of actually what we do in terms of marketing is try and educate about what we do, and it's quite difficult because if you have to start with a piece of education, you're already on a back foot, aren't you? We're essentially we are a private sales platform, so we work a little bit like a private sales department at auction. So we take works in and we consign them, and then we find buyers for them within the network. But there's a few different arms to this as well. So we also do a huge amount of referrals. So we only operate in the prints and editions market. We do occasional sales originals in Banksy and Warhol, but really we are focused on the prints and editions market for a few very key reasons. Our business wouldn't necessarily work across the other categories in the art market. So mainly it's brokering, but the other arms are a mass referral business below £15,000. We don't do private sales under £15,000. It's just it doesn't work as a business model. But we have a lot of collectors who collect quite deeply at that level, and they're looking for valuations. They're looking for, basically sort of buying and selling signals within the market. And because of our products that we've built and the tools that we've created, this is almost like a community and a network of these collectors. So when they do come to us to sell, we'll recommend where they should best sell. And so therefore there's a referral arm of the business into auction houses as well. And we also do a lot of trade business as well at the top end of the triangle, where we work with dealers who are looking specifically for something for their clients.
And so, how do you build trust with clients in a more online environment, or am I wrong in assuming it is all online?
So it's not, so the platform is online, but
Yes.
actually everything when you come to buy and sell is one-to-one with a specialist.
Mm.
So, and we're not peer-to-peer. So we don't do, for instance, like it's not the ArtNet model where something is drop shipped from one client's house to another client's house. Everything comes in to either us in London or to a conservator. So we have partners all over the US, all over Europe. They're all third-party restorers or conservators. All the works come in, they get fully authenticated and condition reports are done. And then only then do they become consigned by us and taken to market. So it's not actually as digital in the actual final stages of sale. It's not a click to buy. You can't do any of that. It's purely a sort of tech digital layer that sits on top of the business in almost all areas.
It's a really, really interesting business model, I would say. So I've been on your platform and it will do things for me that are very valuable, like that give a potential value for something. And it's the way in, I suppose, that if I were then a serious person with more capital, I would then, contact you and make an appointment to come in if I
Yeah.
was really buying. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, everything we do is really our objective is based around creating an entire network where we know where all the printed editions are, quite frankly. I mean, our collectors are fully aware of our agenda here, like, because there's no subscription price, that we've basically built an algorithm, a valuation algorithm. And the reason why it's different and why it's more useful to the prints market is because it looks at, instead of looking at like 3 or 4 auction houses and going, okay, we're going to use that data and then we're going to define it. You can't really do that in the prints market. Not enough goes through the big 4 auction houses. So we actually look at 400 auction houses globally. And then we have a manual process to go, is that the right? Because, things are catalogued in all sorts of ways. Manual process to go through, and then we match artworks, we match values, we match estimates, we match hammers, we match underbids. And so we know exactly what's going on in the market all the time. And then it actually looks at lots of different factors to how that valuation is made. We then, if you come to sell, you'll speak to a specialist, and all our specialists, and I talk about this a lot, that balance between technology and that's the technology working. That's free. That's why you come to us, okay? Because you want to know, actually, can I see every single time this particular Banksy's gone through the auctions in the last sort of 12 years? Yes, you can. You can go and look at that. And then we're going to give you a range of value. Now, that range of value is affected by all the really bad condition versions of that print. It's affected by the auction houses that may be sold at like 3 increments below because they're not particularly well-known auction houses. They didn't have as many bidders. But the idea is that it's a really umbrella look at that. Then you move on to the specialist team. So our specialists all come from the big 4 auction houses. Were in the Prints and Multiples teams there. And now they work to give them what we could. So we talk about it as macro and micro. So that's a macro valuation at tech level. And then it's a micro evaluation when you come to want to sell. And again, there's no fee until you actually are looking to sell. And then even then, we offer sellers 0%, and we take a leading small margin off the buyer because we're very competitive with auction houses. So, and we don't have to charge as much as auction houses because we don't have, bricks and mortar and tour, to have to tour works around the world. And it's not, a lot of clients say to us, like, I don't understand, like, how does that work? And I'm like, well, it's not really magic. It's a very online business. I have tech overheads, which I'm not going to lie. They are substantial, but it's very difficult to run an auction house. It's very, very difficult to make an auction house profitable. I'm always amazed at how well auction houses are doing.
Although the profits aren't usually that great in
Well,
either of the duopoly, for example.
exactly. And I mean, the thing that, you were talking before about, what I learned from Christie's. I was around for the very sad, I was actually on maternity leave at the time, but when South Ken shut down, so Christie's South Ken. Now, Christie's South Ken was, in terms of the London community of Christie's, a very, very special and unique. And it was because it had lots of small departments that were very, very specialized. And those collectors were fanatical. And I love fanatical collectors. Another big thing that I prefer more than art is fanatical collectors. People who are absolutely obsessed with one thing. There is nothing more rewarding than talking to a collector who is just alive with interest in a particular subject. That doesn't really exist anymore. That has moved online. That entire very collectible, that lower end collectible world has moved online. And my point is that we've talked about profit and what you learn. Most of the South Ken, other than those very specialist sales, and I was lucky enough to work on things like the largest Steiff teddy bear collection and the Out of the Ordinary sale, which was where we would sell everything from like a 1950s cyborg robot to a Swarovski encrusted dog skeleton to just the film props and James Bond's underpants and, just like the most wonderful thing. And then the people and the characters that come in looking for that kind of stuff make that sale. They absolutely make it. But other than those sales, you spend an awful lot of time consigning collections that are 90. So basically, a collector comes in, they consign something for the top end of the market in an evening sale. But of course, you have to find a place for everything else, don't you? You can't say, well, we're not interested in everything else. And that's where, a company like South Ken starts to struggle because everything's brought in on a deal that cannot be supported by that end of the market. So one of my big learnings when I started working on my art broker was, and this was a kind of a deal we made between the three of us, the two brothers and myself, we do prints. That's what we do. And we do it really, really well. We don't get distracted by, yes, we occasionally make originals happen. And yes, we work with the trade to facilitate relationships, but we do this one thing and we do it really, really well. And I think that's where, that almost works, by the way, I think in every business anywhere. Like as soon as you see something going wrong in a business or you see profit drifting, it's because you're going outside of your wheelhouse and you're getting, we call them shiny things. Is that a shiny thing? And sometimes it's not a shiny thing. Sometimes it looks like a shiny thing, but it's actually something you should do. It's really quite hard to know what's a shiny thing and what's actually something that could be a piece of scale for the business.
Yeah, I often say if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah.
It's a good old fashioned saying. What I was going to ask is I remember at the Art Business Conference, I think you were talking there in London this year, and I think you were saying correct me if I'm wrong, you said something about it's not AI, we do machine learning, not AI. Is that right that you said that? Maybe you could explain that, because I was going to ask, do collectors trust algorithmic valuations?
Mm-hmm.
So how does your...
Also, you asked me how you build and trust with an online business, and then I went off on a tangent, didn't I? So I should probably attach that. I think
So it's about trust of the AI process, but also trust of
Yeah. I mean, I think building trust outside of being a really massive household name is a huge challenge, and that's another thing that one has to really learn when they come outside of, if you got the Christie's name, it's Christie's. Like, it's amazing what you can do with the Christie's name. It's amazing what they do, So first of all, I would say to anyone who is at that career level where they're like, I'm ready to jump ship from one of these amazing, huge institutions, bear in mind you're going into the unknown, really having to build a brand, build authority. That's why content's so important. That's why editorial is still important. That's why AI is very dangerous, because everyone can create almost anything and you have to stand out. I am so bored of seeing LinkedIn post after LinkedIn post written by AI. I am so bored of seeing articles written, by various people that are clearly... we use AI all the time. I'm an absolute advocate of AI, but I believe in the sandwich effect, which I call the sandwich effect, but actually, and it used to be a bit of a joke, but it's a very good analogy. The AI is the jam in between. The sandwich is not a sandwich without the jam. So you need that thing inside to be able to extend yourself and make yourself, my ChatGPT and the different AI tools I use, they're like tiny personal assistants to me, like they're really good. They know me really well. They hold my information. They know how I like things done. I mean, occasionally they have to be told to remember that I don't like that. But I use them to extend the team. We as a company spend a lot of time doing workshops and doing training sessions with AI. There's a lot of resistance around that from the more academic members of the team. There's a little bit too much excitement about AI from other members of the team. So it's, managing, like, that's a little bit too far. No, we can't believe that this will do everything for us. But also, life is full of things that, I love one of the AI trainers that we use. When I first started talking to him, I was like, I don't want these guys using AI. Okay. I want these guys using AI. And he was like, do you remember in the 90s when the internet became something that we had in our homes? And I vividly remember, as he told me this, my father saying to me that someone in the office, I think it was his secretary, needed a computer on her desk because she needed to use the internet. and it's laughable now, isn't it? It's like, no. we all needed to use the internet. But I think we're still, even 6 months ago at least, we were all still at this stage of like, well, I don't need AI. It's not what I do. A traditional specialist in the old master category, doesn't need AI, do they? Wouldn't they possibly need AI for? It's all so, and that's not the way to look at it. Absolutely not. Everyone can use AI, but the sandwich effect is you need the human, the feeling, and I use feeling very importantly there. You need that feeling going into the machine. Then you need the machine to take it. And then as it comes out, you need to make sure that you've got that human approach, particularly, I think, in any market which is want, not need. I think the opportunities for humanless businesses to thrive with AI only are going to be the need. I need to tax my car. I need to get, the NHS medicine, huge area of need that works really well. Optimize it all. AI at all, create flows. Machine learning has already done a lot that it could have done. But in worlds where it's about want, not need, you've got to maximize the human being as much as possible. And that's how you build authority, right? So that's how you tell stories to people and how you step outside of your comfort zone in an industry that is very traditional and set in its ways. You have to say things that people don't like. And then people go, well, we don't think that. Actually, then you build, for instance, I'm very proud of the American pop market that we've built over the last 3 years. We didn't used to deal as much American pop in the early days as we do now. Now it's one of our biggest markets. Why? Because we brought the specialists in that really understood the works, We invested in external that help us and support us so we would never make any mistakes. And also you have to turn business away sometimes because we can't afford to make mistakes in an online business. I can't afford to have that work that wasn't quite what it was meant to be. So you have to build that trust, you have to actually be quite honest with yourself and go, trust is everything. It's not just like an addition to the brand. It's everything. If we take this on and we're not 100% sure about it, then, that could be the end of that authority that we've built over the past sort of 6-7 years. I mean, the business goes back 15 years, but certainly, as we've grown into a Prince and Multiples platform.
Yeah, funnily enough, I was saying to my students at the start of the academic year, you're all using AI. We know that. We're going to we're going to ask you and train you and expect you to use it as an assistant, but not to generate your own text. And if you do that, it may seem as though it's going to be okay, but it's very easy for us to identify. We may not be able to prove it. You may pass, but, we like to see the individual human element coming through, So I think at the moment it's an assistant is a good relationship at the moment. It might change.
How do you police that? I'm fascinated by it.
It's impossible. It's very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah.
I tell you, I have learned, I thought, right, I'm going to do some experiments and start trying to get it to write a little bit about maybe something that I'm doing and just see what it comes up with compared to what I do. So at the moment, it still hallucinates sources if it can't find a source online, and very often it can't because there's firewalls. If it's trying to find an academic source, it just can't get it. So it will make it up. It will always get the page wrong. So the first thing I do is check a few of the bibliographic entries in a student essay. I just sort of look at, and then you find one that doesn't seem to exist. I asked my library, could you do a deeper search for this? No, it doesn't exist. We've looked at the hard copy journal. It's just not in there. So you can catch people like that. But generally, as you say, you can just tell when we've all done it, when we've been tired or need, you write an email. It can be very good at writing good emails, I think. But every now and then it makes a terrible mistake, as you said. So you have to check it anyway.
I think if people look at it less like a utility and more like somebody they're training, because you're training, you're essentially saying that I'm the boss, but and this is what I need you to do for me. And the thing that's really helpful is that it actually helps in the right way, and actually it's hugely helpful for people dyslexic for us quickly. We lost.
We lost. There was some Wi-Fi connect. I don't know whether it's yours or mine. Mine looks pretty full, but we just lost a little bit there. Don't worry about it. It happens.
Mine looks full too, but it might be me.
It's okay. So what I wonder whether you could share. Do you have a memorable story, perhaps a client success or a transaction that illustrates the value of your approach? I don't know whether there's anything that you can think about anecdotally.
I think there's a few things that I think one of the key. I mean, it's really interesting, our clients, because people might suspect, and we talked about this a little bit before, David, might suspect that we're like the Gen Z way of buying and selling. And we do have a lot of much younger clients and people entering the market. But, I just said we work a huge amount in the American pop market. Well, that market is pretty much dominated in terms of the collectors by boomers. It's, they are, they all bought in the 70s and, very well. And they've been holding these collections. And I talk a lot about the big wealth transfer. So we are by no means a company that is, I would say that 80% of the sales that we do are with the boomer generation. So it's not a company that like suddenly kind of radicalizes the next generation yet. I was saying something, I was talking to Sarah Briggs, who is marketing at Philips. And I was talking about, we've just got to move this world on. And, we were saying how like in reality, I think it's something like, I think I talked about this at ABC, but over 50% of the £1 million+ market are collectors. Generation will be dead in 20 years' time.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the market still revolves around them. And Sarah said to me, yeah, but 20 years is a long time, Charlotte. And they want the market like it is. And I thought it was such a crucial point, really crucial point. And we talk a lot, and, we've got the Art Tech conference coming up tomorrow. Is it tomorrow or Friday? Talking about Art Market 2050. Okay, 2050. That's like 25 years from now. So it was really interesting because those boomers will be dead. Big wealth transfer will have happened, and we'll be selling into millennials and, Gen Zs. Are you still there, David? Or have I?
Yeah, I am. I've turned my video off because I wonder if the bandwidth is because, if we maybe both of us should turn the video off just for the end. Should we try that? Or should we try? Yep.
There we go.
Yeah. Apologies to people viewing YouTube, but otherwise this is going to get interrupted. So I think it's fine. Yeah. So we were talking about Gen Z as the new generation.
Friday, people talk a lot about how resistant this market is to, and I'm one of those people. I talk about how resistant the market is to technology. I bang on about it all the time. I talk about how antiquated we are and how isn't it mad that we still sell art like we sold cattle in the Middle Ages. It's like but actually, have we ever considered that actually the controlling element of the actually didn't, let alone did they didn't grow up with a telephone or a computer in their house. There's what some dealers call the buddy system. Human tell you about it. I don't want to go online, like interact with a digital space to tell them what I own and what's in my collection. And I think we have to be quite aware of that. We have to be aware that, we're not going to launch this concept of being able to launch a product or an app that will suddenly just make sense to this market and these collectors. I think is the wrong way to approach it. I think it's about ease. So I think people want things to be convenient. People want to be able to do something instant. And they want for really.
Apologies, there was a little bit of an interruption there while we were sorting out our tech. It doesn't happen so often these days.
When we're talking about technology, everyone's technology wrong.
Exactly. How do we build trust?
Yeah.
So anyway, Charlotte, just kind of finishing up now with a couple more final questions. Looking ahead, where do you see the art brokerage industry in 5 years' time?
I think that I think 5 years is a really interesting question to ask, like that particular period of time, because we are currently on a bit of a precipice, aren't we? Of just 5 years ago, we had COVID. And as I said earlier, everyone suddenly had to go, oh, we need to be online. We need to be digital. We need to be everywhere. We need to be in everyone's pockets on their phones. Otherwise, we have no chance of survival. Now we're in we're all sort of comfortable with the concept that AI is going to make technology and building, what people who don't work in tech businesses don't realize how phenomenal AI can be for development. Remember that developers, they work like machines anyway. They are like code as a machine. So,
Mm.
and obviously that still needs a huge amount of human. It's still the sandwich effect that I talked about. Like, they need to be trained and directed. But the amount you can build now within a blink of an eye compared to what you could do 5 years ago is off the scale. So I think we're going to see advancements like accelerated. However, the whole art market, by the way, this is the other kind of slightly paradoxical thing about the art market. We talk about how traditional it is, but also it moves at the speed of light. I mean, when you imagine, this is one of my, we're talking about sort of like anecdotes that we sort of wheel out all the time. When you imagine that actually the first work that sold over £1 million, I mean, bear in mind inflation, was in 1970.
Mm.
And then you fast forward to like Beeple, NFT selling for 69 million. It's not very, we're talking 30 years. So we talk about this world like it's archaic and it is archaic. Like there are large parts of it that are, just always going to work like they've always worked until they can't anymore because that client base and that collector base is, as we just talked about, no longer with us. But actually, there is always going to be a need for both innovation and human specialism. And so when we talk about 5 years' time, I think that we'll see a few things. I think that we'll see technology being built at a speed of light to facilitate everything from authentication to sales to information, education. David, I'd love to ask you the same question about art education in 5 years' time. What does that look like? I think that information is, off the scale, but actually knowing who to trust and which information to look at is becoming harder and harder because there's just really so much noise. There's so much noise already. I think that digital marketing will become much more curated. You'll be able to say, I don't want to know about this. I do want to know about this. Whether or not that will make it easier or harder in this industry is yet to be seen. I think the brokerage is an interesting one because I think it will be very different depending on, I always treat the art market as a triangle. Masterpieces at the top, core sales where I put prints and editions that we deal with. So, average value of £50,000 up to, £800,000. And then the bottom of the triangle is which everything else, everything below that sort of £15,000 mark, which is a huge volume business, but perhaps very, very different business. And I think what's interesting in the last 10 years is that certainly when I worked with the proposals department at Christie's and when we were putting together big consignment pitches, we would be talking most of the time to a private client. We would be saying, this is what we'd like to do. Be to a personal pitch to a private client or a private family. Now that has almost completely disappeared and you speak to an advisor. So, you don't really touch the private client. The advisor kind of makes the call for the family or the client. But on the flip side, the prints market, that core market, has become much more, we did a big collector survey recently where we spoke to all our print collectors, and you had to be an almost exclusive print collector to qualify to be part of the data. 85% of them don't use an art advisor. And these are people that are buying at relatively high level.
Mm.
But it's because of the category. The category, as far as they're concerned, is, it's a much more economic business, isn't it? Like, you can buy a print at a high street gallery and spend 3 times the price of the fair what it should be sold for. And you can bid at an auction in a small regional auction house and get something that's perhaps a lot better deal than at a big auction house that's got more exposure. You can speak to a dealer and make sure that your commissions aren't, you can come to us and really be able to see the shape of the market and then work with a specialist like you would at an auction house. There's 1,000 different ways to buy. They're much more educated. Data is much more at their fingertips. So I think it really depends. I think you'll find the top end of the market is almost, in 5 years, is almost exclusively run by advisors. I think actually working direct, as a broker in terms of a dealer will become even less, which is hard, right? Because it creates a very expensive art market. There's 5 people in a chain to secure an artwork. And we've already talked about how unprofitable that top part of the triangle can be. And that's going to make it quite difficult. Whereas I think mass, people talk about democratizing the art market, which I think is actually it's a bit of a joke. Like, you can't democratize, it's the art market. And the art market we're talking about is still a relatively elite industry. You've got to, in order to get really involved, you've got to have a substantial amount of money to really operate in the blue chip art market. So any sort of democratizing it is probably the wrong term, I think. But I think there will be the opportunity for people to use tools to benchmark, to compare. And I would hope that a lot of that opaque behind the screens, well, I know this guy who knows this, has almost been called out. Like younger collectors particularly just won't have the patience for it. So I think
Steve Phillips at the ABC conference was saying that. He was saying that they don't like, the Gen Z don't like gatekeepers anymore, and they create their own markets in their social clubs, which are all taking place on social media. I've just bought this print. Oh, where did you get it? And they're kind of, that's the way that's operating, which I find fascinating compared to as you say, the higher ends of the art market.
I think that's really interesting. But I also think, which is quite controversial, that Gen Z nepotism has never been it's off the scale. So in terms of the emerging artist market, I don't know whether there's going to be as many free thinking collectors as perhaps there were, but that's me talking as a kind of aging millennial. But I think the social media itself is a very tricksy marketing platform. Instagram particularly, there are facades you can create. So, which is why we tend to lean on data, because we're very aware that that's ultimately a closer piece of truth than perhaps.
Yeah, it's the same. I play a game that is with the art world. My students have their own league. It's run by Art Tactic, Anders Pettersson, and they have this thing called Art Forecaster, where you have to guess the correct band of the eventual price at auction. Half of this is I train my students. I say half of this is actually an instinct and just becoming more and more experienced. You do better the more you look at all of what's going on. But the other, the other half is looking at data. And when I've tried to only do this with my hunches, which is most of the time because I just don't have time to kind of look at the data to give a data informed decision. When I use the data, I always do better, which is interesting. So it's again a mix of your own experience and instincts and just the aesthetic of the work. Is this actually a nice Basquiat, or is it, plus the data?
First of all, you'd obviously be a lot better at doing that than someone with, because you have so much knowledge. But I do think it's different in the prints market again, because I was talking to someone who was in the post-war contemporary department at Sotheby's for a very long time, and we were talking about specialism and whether or not, she could value a print as easily as one might think. She's dealt with original Basquiats all the time. Could she come into his print market and value them? And she was really concerned, and she was like, but there's there are real numbers on that. It's like when you value a canvas, a standalone unique, it's a little bit kind of thing, admittedly, it's a little bit sort of something quite personal about it. It's not something that goes, of course you can look at the artists, the works that have come to auction, you can look at demand, you can look at the curve of that market. But with the prints market, you can actually be wrong. You can be wrong. There is a key set of data which can make it's a very different discipline, very different.
Now, that's really interesting. Look, Charlotte, I'm aware of the time now. We're both getting our work. It's freeze week, and we've got probably other appointments. So I'd just like to thank you on behalf of all the listeners to what I think has been a fascinating conversation. And before we close, where can listeners find you and learn more about MyArtBroker? Obviously, I can put the link on the. Maybe that's enough.
Google MyArtBroker and you'll find us. We also have, we are on Instagram quite heavily, and we also have a magazine called Edition Magazine, which is part of the website. So do come and find it.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure.